Let's break down the OpenChat function step by step. Display chat box. Chatbox.style.display equals block sets the display property of the chat box to block, making it visible on the web page. Set chat heading. Chat heading.text content equals chat with $username sets the text content of the chat heading to indicate the user the current user is chatting with. Fetch previous messages for the sender. This function named fetch messages is defined inside the OpenChat function. It checks if the current user clicked is different from the username parameter. If it is different, it updates the current user clicked to username. It logs the information about fetching messages for the current user and the user being contacted. It makes an HTTP request to the server endpoint /getMessages/ current user $username / to fetch the previous messages between the current user and the user being contacted. If the response from the server is successful, response.ok, it parses the JSON response. It checks if the response data has a valid structure with messages. It sorts the messages by timestamp in descending order. It clears the chat messages box, chatmessages.innerHTML equals, to avoid duplicate messages. It iterates over each message in the data and creates a new div element to display the message with the sender's username and content. These message divs are appended to the chat messages element. After updating the chat box with the received messages, it scrolls to the bottom of the chat box. Set interval for fetching messages. Set interval fetch messages 1000 calls the fetch messages function at intervals of 1000 milliseconds, 1 second, to continuously fetch new messages. Fetch previous messages for the receiver. Immediately after defining the fetch messages function, it makes another HTTP request to fetch previous messages from the perspective of the receiver. Fetch /getMessages/ username / current user /. This request fetches messages from the server endpoint /getMessages/ username / current user /. The getMessages endpoint is a custom endpoint in your Django application that likely handles fetching messages between two users from your database. Let's break down how this endpoint might work. URL configuration. In your Django application's urls.py, you would have defined a URL pattern for the getMessages endpoint, specifying the view function that handles this endpoint. View function. In your Django application's views, you would have a view function associated with the getMessages endpoint. This view function would retrieve messages from the database based on the sender and receiver usernames provided in the URL parameters, fetching messages from database. Inside the view function associated with the getMessages endpoint, you would use Django's ORM object relational mapping to query the database for messages between the sender and receiver. You might use Django's filter method on your message model to retrieve messages that match the sender and receiver usernames. Once you have retrieved the messages from the database, you would serialize them into a JSON format to send back as a response to the client, returning messages as JSON response. After fetching the messages and serializing them into JSON format, your view function would return an HTTP response with the JSON data containing the messages. This JSON response would be sent back to the client-side JavaScript code that made the request to the getMessages endpoint. Client-side handling. On the client side, in your JavaScript code, you would make an AJAX request to the getMessages endpoint. When the response is received from the endpoint, your JavaScript code would parse the JSON data containing the messages. It would then update the chatbox interface on the web page to display the fetched messages. In summary, the messages present in the getMessages endpoint are fetched from the database by a view function in your Django application. The view function retrieves the messages based on the sender and receiver usernames provided in the URL parameters, serializes them into JSON format, and returns them as a response to the client-side JavaScript code. Let's break down how the get_messages view function works. URL parameters. The view function get_messages expects 3 parameters in the URL: sender_username and receiver_username. These parameters represent the usernames of the sender and receiver of the messages. Retrieve user profiles. The view function uses get_object_ or _404 to retrieve the user profile instances, corresponding to the sender and receiver usernames. It queries the user profile model based on the user_username field, which accesses the username field of the related user model. Retrieve messages. The view function queries the message1 model to retrieve messages between the sender and receiver. It uses filter to retrieve messages where either the sender is sender_profile and the receiver is receiver_profile, or the sender is receiver_profile and the receiver is sender_profile. This ensures that messages between the sender and receiver are retrieved, regardless of who initiated the conversation. The messages are ordered by their timestamps in ascending order. Format messages. After retrieving the messages, the view function formats them into a list of dictionaries. Each dictionary contains the sender's username and the content of the message. Return JSON response. Finally, the view function returns a JSON response containing the formatted message list. The JSON response includes a key-value pair where the key is messages and the value is the formatted message list. In summary, the get_messages view function retrieves messages between 2 users based on their usernames. It formats the messages into a list of dictionaries and returns them as a JSON response. This view function is responsible for providing the messages to the client-side JavaScript code that requested them.